Yep. So, like I said, everybody, if anybody popped in while we were working through all the little stuff we had to work through, my name's Jared. I'm the training coordinator for Central Ohio Fools. Um, Lex was Lex recently joined the chapter, and she's been pretty active on social media and different podcasts and so on, speaking about building construction, and has a passion for the job. So we were excited to get to have her do a class on building construction for us and teach us some new stuff and help us refresh on things that maybe we forgot. So, without further ado, Lex Shady.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys. Like you said, my name's Lex. I am pretty decent at social media, clearly horrible at technology, so thanks for bearing with me. Wanted to take a second and say thanks to the Fools for having me on, and hopefully we can all just get a little bit out of this tonight. So I'm just a fireman from Central Ohio. There's really nothing special. I've just passing on the things that have been taught to me from other firemen. I believe that the only way to make the fire service better is to share what we learn. So I'm just trying to do that for you guys tonight. So these are just a few of the books that I've used to help me study buildings throughout the last couple of years. If you're looking for anything construction related, you honestly can't go wrong with any books by Chief Dunn. If you're a visual learner, I really suggest the Building Construction Illustrated. That's the Francis Ching book in the bottom left there. It's basically a picture book of buildings. I'm a really visual learner, so some of the stuff that I was reading in the other books, I couldn't visualize, and that book kind of helped bring it to life. And then finally, I know it's really hard to get your hands on, but I really believe that everyone needs a copy of Fireground Tactics. The guy was way before his time. It was written back in the 70s. And obviously some of the stuff has changed today, but a lot of it is still really applicable. And I really believe that that's a book that tells you a lot about the history of the fire service, but you can still learn a lot from today. So why do we care about building construction? Well, we should care because a building's the one thing that directly or indirectly affects everything we do on the fire ground. You can know all there is to know about fire behavior, your tools, your tactics, but none of that holds any value if you're unfamiliar with the space which they're relied upon. In other words, we care about building construction because the building doesn't. So a quick refresher, the 5 types of building construction. Type 1 is fire resistive, type 2 is non-combustible, type 3 is ordinary, type 4 is heavy timber, and type 5 is wood frame. First up is type 1, fire resistive. Fire resistant construction is made of concrete and protective steel. When you think of these, you typically think of tall structures. When asked for examples, most people automatically go to downtown high-rise buildings, but another example would be hospitals and some hotels and casinos. Type 2 is non-combustible. These are different from fire resistive simply by the fire rating. The steel in type 2 is not covered with a fire retarding material. The walls and roof are made of non-combustible building material, and it's usually reinforced masonry with a concrete roof. For these examples, you typically think of box buildings like Walmarts and Lowe's, some strip malls. Type 3 is ordinary construction, or what we like to call Main Street USA. For type 3, the exterior is made of non-combustible walls. Interior floors, walls, and roof are made of combustible material. On these, 2 walls are load-bearing, 2 are not. You'll find these to be a lot of your older downtown buildings and some brick residential homes. The next couple of slides, we're going to hit on some key hazards of these buildings and some tips for identifying them. First up, we have to know whether we're looking at brick or facade, and looking at brickwork can help you identify this. To do this, we have to understand first what brick orientation is. So brick orientation is simply the way that bricks are laid in the wall, and there are 6 ways as in the photo on the top left. We primarily care about 2 ways, the stretcher, which is the most common, and the header course, which is for stability. A course of brick is a layer of the same unit running horizontally, in other words, what makes the height of the building. And these bricks are used for, like I said, stability or sometimes decoration. Width, on the other hand, is how many layers wide the brick is. Buildings are typically wider at the bottom, getting narrower at the top. The height of the building determines how many widths of brick are used. Typically, there's 3 to 4 at the base and 1 to 2 at the top. Again, it just varies based on the building and how tall it is. But this is important to remember because the crack down low does not mean the same as a crack up high. And as I said before, to identify brick versus facade, we look at the brickwork. Typically what we're looking for is the header course, and this is a layer of support bricks where the bricks are laid on end, and it occurs every 7th to 9th row. And when you find that, that's how you know that you're looking at brick versus facade. A big thing with ordinary construction is the mass number of void spaces that are spread throughout the structure. To help identify these risk factors and the risk factors associated with them, we try to break them down into 2 different types, inherent and acquired. Inherent voids are just as they sound. They're due to the building's original design, where acquired voids are simply due to additional construction and alterations. The picture on the left is type 5 construction, but it's a great example of what an inherent void is. Some other examples of these voids include cornice work, mansard parapets, wood frame canopies, window frame voids, floor or ceiling voids, stud bays, cock blocks, pike chases, cant stripping, that kind of thing. Examples of acquired voids include drop ceilings on the top floor, creating a double void under a cock loft, hallways framed into closets, concealed transom windows, larger original rooms framed into smaller rooms, rain roofs over flat roofs, etc. The photo on the right is a really good example of an acquired void. It's an addition of a wood-framed awning over windows. Based on the definition, acquired voids are obviously much more hazardous to firefighters since additions are commonly done without permits or with regard to safety or codes. This is just another example of why it's really important that we get out in our streets and look at the buildings, especially if we know that something's going through a renovation process. A lot of times with voids like these, we aren't going to know they're there unless we catch it during the renovation. Another thing commonly associated with ordinary construction is cast iron. Cast iron was commonly used as support columns or as part of the facade. The failure of cast iron has no warning, completely breaks and collapses, shattering into tiny pieces. Unlike what many of us were taught, cast iron failure and water application has no correlation. It's strictly heat combined with substandard casting, not the rapid cooling of cold water on the hot metal. It's a collapse hazard both interiorly and exteriorly, as it can bring down the floor or the front of the building when it fails. To tell whether it's cast iron, like on a facade, you can just walk up and tap on it and you'll be able to hear if it's metal or wood. Sometimes they're hard to tell if they're painted, but if you touch it, you can tell. Another hazard with type 3 construction are terrazzo floors. These are polished wood coverings made of chips of marble, quartz, glass, etc., poured into cement. The hazard with these is they add significant weight to the floor beams and they hide heat and weakness in the floor from firefighters above. A really good fire to study the importance of these floors is the 23rd Street fire in New York City in 1966. 12 firefighters were killed from this type of floor collapse. As we all know, as you advance through a structure, you should sound the floor to check for the integrity. You do this by forcefully striking the floor with your tool. Wooden floors are going to make a hollow sound and your tool bounces, as we all know. But masonry floors will make it kind of a clanking sound, and there's going to be a vibration across the floor. The finding of these floors should be communicated to command immediately so they can make the decision on whether or not they want to allow crews to continue to advance in the structure. When doing walkthroughs in your Main Street buildings, or any building really, take a look at the floor. It tells you a couple of things. One, the presence of floor grates can be an indicator of a basement below. And two, watch the area where the floor meets the wall. When advancing through a structure, you want to keep an eye here because any form of separation in this area is an indicator of potential weakness, and continuing to advance in this room needs to be done with care. So these are examples of transom windows. They come with more hazards than just the risk of breaking and allowing overhead fire spread. In the first picture on the left, you can see the height of the door has been shortened, and you can tell that simply by comparing the 2 hallway doors. And then the first door has a transom window, so it's safe to assume that the second door probably had one as well, and it's just simply been concealed. So if there's a fire in that second room, you're going to want to open that area to check for fire spread in that void. The second picture shows the overhead hazard that sometimes transom windows pose. It's common to see air conditioners put in these windows over entrances. This creates the risk of the air conditioner falling on you as you're making entry. If there's going to be a primary entrance or egress point for your crews, you may want to consider removing it. So next up is type 4 or heavy timber construction. The idea behind heavy timber is the inherent fire protection based on mass. The beams are going to char while the structure integrity isn't necessarily affected as severely as smaller dimensional wood. While heavy timber is slower to ignite typically, once it does ignite, it conversely has the potential to become unstoppable. Fires in these buildings usually make the news if they spread. So they're made of large dimensional lumber. Main framing members are no less than 8 by 8, and they must have non-combustible walls. Unlike type 3, where 2 walls were load-bearing and 2 were not, all 4 walls of this structure are going to be load-bearing. Each piece of wood that goes in this structure has a standard for the minimum dimensions. So NFPA 220, the standard on building construction, has the rest of those dimensions if you're curious. When you're thinking about this type of building, think churches, old mill-type factories, old gyms. It's sometimes confused with type 5 heavy timber wood frame buildings, such as an old barn, but the difference is that those have combustible walls, so they're not the same thing. These photos are another example of a type 4. As you can see on the top photo on the left, that's the example of the exterior and shows the masonry walls. And you can see the main framing members are the large dimensional lumber on the photo on the right. And the bottom photo is the original tongue and groove flooring. One quick look at these photos and you can quickly see the difference between this and the lightweight construction used today. These photos are from this, the same building in the previous slide. This is actually an old type 4 shoe factory currently being remodeled into an apartment complex. There's a couple things to notice about this building. One, in the top left photo, you can see the original wall ties that run in the void, as in the left side of the building where they're running above the window frame. That would be kind of in the floor void. Versus the anchor straps that have been added for additional support, and these are the stars that are surrounding the windows. The photo on the right gives us a glimpse of the voids acquired by framing larger rooms into smaller rooms. This renovation gives us a sort of mixed building construction type, as the beams are being reinforced with lighter weight lumber and the frames no longer match the traditional type 4 dimensions. A fire in this building is going to burn differently than a traditional type 4, and the interior now has lightweight construction. This is something to keep in mind when doing walkthroughs. You don't want to automatically assume that this building is going to take a long time to burn when the interior materials are now different. So these are examples of wall ties versus anchor straps. This is something I learned once I was on the job. I always assumed that the presence of a plate indicated a wall tie. However, there is a difference. Wall ties are attached to the building floor by cast iron or steel plates. They're typically stars or rectangular shaped, and they're spread evenly along the wall. Rods usually run through the floor voids, so they'll typically, like I said, be between floors, and they're evenly spaced and designed to tie a non-bearing wall to the floor beams behind it. Some tie rods include a turnbuckle to allow for adjustment of tension throughout the years. Anchor straps, however, are typically steel or cast iron plates. However, they're smaller than the traditional wall tie. They can be found throughout the structure, not just in the void areas. They're found as short straps tied to a joist behind the wall. You can see that in the bottom left photo there. They're typically added later after the brick wall began to lean or buckle to try to prevent it from moving further. Like I said, you can differentiate between the two by both the location and the size. And usually if they're spread symmetrically in a line throughout the building, those are typically original and the wall tie. So next is wood frame construction, or type 5. Most of our districts here in rural Ohio anyway are made of these. Signature characteristics, as we all know, are combustible walls and roofs, typically residential. And as we all know, we're also seeing them go up as apartment complexes as well. My city's actually getting its first one, should be completed in a couple months. With these, it's really important to know your district, know the ages and sections of your city. Depending on where you're from, legacy construction ended around the 1950s, so anything after that would be considered what we call modern. We're going to dive into the whole legacy versus lightweight construction discussion next, but just remember, it's important to know the inherent characteristics associated with the construction types of each. So these are just a couple photos showing the difference between a legacy and a modern construction house. The photo on the left is obviously legacy, and the photo on the right is what we call modern. So like I said, the years that define legacy construction may vary some depending on what textbook you're looking at, but this gives you a general idea. Legacy frame construction can be considered the 1930s, made of solid dimensional lumber, and typically built with rafters versus trusses. These come with inherent hazards. We're going to hit on all these examples later, but they include unique construction styles, side entrances or servant stairs, firefighter carbonization, pocket doors, window transoms, wet walls, knee walls, and gusset plates. This particular example in the photo is a balloon frame with shed roof addition. It's not a salt box, we'll talk about that later, but it shows a full 2-story with attic, and we can tell this through the full height of the walls in the 2nd story. The side entrance can indicate where a potential set of second stairs are, and you can notice the window in the upstairs, the air conditioner in the upstairs window. We can use this both as an indicator of the date of the house for poor central air, and it also is obviously the location of a potential bedroom. So these next couple of photos are just some more examples of legacy homes. So this is a balloon frame. I don't have the exact age of this house, but the houses on either side are dated at 1900, so it's safe to assume it's around the same time. For balloon frame, long narrow windows are an indicator as a stone foundation and center chimneys, but really the only way to know for sure is to go inside and look at the walls. If you go to the basement and shine up a light up along the wall, you should be able to see clear to the top, and that's how you can tell that it's a balloon frame. This is another example of a balloon frame house. However, this one has an addition to it. The part of the left of the house of that red line, that's the original balloon frame, and to the right is the addition. So when this happens, it's a hazard and something to pay attention to because it's created an interior balloon frame wall. So next up is platform construction. This is a really good example. This is a training house we used. We assumed it was balloon frame based on what we talked about before, which is the long, narrow windows, the center chimney, and the foundation. However, once we got inside, we saw it was actually platform construction. So when I learned about balloon frame, I always said that I would rather assume it was balloon frame rather than not, because I would just rather assume that the fire was going to spread around me. However, a counter argument that I was given that day was that if you assume that it's balloon frame and it's actually platform, but you've opened a hole in the floor near the wall on the 1st story and you're trying to flow water in the basement, it's not going to go anywhere. So sometimes it's not really safe to make an assumption because the water is not going to be doing what you want it to do. So it's just something to consider. So this is a photo from the basement of that house, and this is what we saw when we got down there to show us that it was actually platform versus balloon frame. So next up is half stories versus full stories. In a half story, the roof line terminates at or near the floor. They don't have full 8-foot walls, and side vents can be indicators of the void spaces. Key features of half stories are the presence of knee walls. And like we said, the exterior indicators of these are the wall height, dormers versus false dormers, and the vents. This particular example is a 1.5 story. The vents act as indicators for the approximate location of the knee walls. And remember, do not make the mistake of opening a knee wall without a charged line in place. Even if you have a tick and see no heat, you can have smoke and fire behind that wall. As soon as you open it, we all know it provides oxygen and it can quickly overtake the room. Half stories can come in many shapes and sizes. These are just a few more examples of some that I have in my particular city. Remember to differentiate between a half and full story. You're looking for attic vents, dormers, and where the roof line ends and the wall height. You want to be able to recognize half stories so you know to look for fire in the void spaces and communicate that to interior crews. When you hear that something is a half story over the radio when you're doing your size up, that automatically is giving you a different picture of the structure and what to look for when you're looking for fire spread. So like I said, they come in different sizes. The photo on the top left is the 2.5 stories. So you have the 2 full stories and then the half. Photo on the right is a 2 full story with an attic. And the photo on the bottom is a hybrid. The left half of the structure is 2 full stories with an attic, and the right half is 2 full stories with a half. Similar in construction is a gambrel roof style. This is simply a symmetrical 2-sided roof with 2 slopes on each side. Another name for it is a Dutch roof. I bring this one up because it's kind of a hybrid, as the top floor walls are 8 foot, but it also has knee walls like a half story. Everyone has their own way to size of a building, but if you call this a half story, again, it's reminding people of the voids and to check that space for knee walls and potential fire. So these photos are some interior examples of what knee walls look like. The top left photo shows you a slice of the building as if you remove that exterior wall. So you can see the framed room in the center and the void and the knee walls on each side. The closet photo on the right is a closet built into a knee wall. What this did is basically create a framed void within a void with a fire load. And these are really common in my area to have this closet built in. It's used for storage. Some people turn them into like little playrooms for their kids as well, so it's something that you'll want to keep in mind. Again, do not make the mistake of opening a knee wall without the charge line. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from senior guys that went in, thought it was no big deal, opened the wall without a line, and then had to bail when the fire overtook the room. Even if you have the tick, something can be hidden behind there, and as soon as you open it, the fire is going to spread. When overhauling these areas, you're going to want to make sure to check both sides of the room and the peak of the roof near the roof vent for vertical extension. Another kind of legacy construction is salt box, and this is a unique one. The key feature of this style is the continuous roof line from the first story to the peak of the roof. It's important to know because if the fire gets in the roof line at the first story level, it can extend rapidly to the roof line via the trench effect. So this is going to be a visual of the King's Cross fire in London in 1987, but the fire spread principle is the same. Once the fire gets into the roof line, there's nothing to stop it from going to the ridge and spreading across the rest of the roof. As with any peaked roof, there's collapse risk from fire exposure due to the structural framing, roof decking, etc. But what makes salt boxes different than the typical peak roof is at the speed at which the fire can spread. When fighting these fires, make sure to send a crew to the upper floors to check for extensions. Like I said, this video is an example of how that will happen.
The escalator trench acted as a chimney, made not of brick, but of highly flammable wood. At 7:45, a superheated wall of gas suddenly rushed up the escalator, priming everything in its path to burn.
So I show these photos next to just notice the break in the roof line because these are not considered salt box. They have a similar style, but the photo on the left would be a gable roof with shed addition, and the one on the right is a hip roof with a shed addition. The fire still has the potential to spread, but because of that break in the roof line, it's not as rapidly as in the previous photos. So another hazard with legacy construction is pyrophoric carbonization. If you go into old attics, you can rub your fingers on the ceiling joist and you'll sometimes find like a charcoal like dust that shows up on your hands. Essentially what this is the wood is slowly oxidizing and it's losing its moisture. And when that happens, it can burn a lot more intensely at lower ignition temperatures than you would usually see. Some people have said that fires can start simply from a light bulb touching the wood in an old attic. Another thing we can see in legacy construction is pocket doors. Because of the way the pocket doors work, there's inherent voids in both the walls and along the top of the door, and this can allow for a hidden fire spread in the wall. Even if these doors are closed off, sometimes we'll see the doors completely removed and then something put over that to seal it, or sometimes the doors will just be pushed in the wall and sealed off. Even if that happens, you can still have that void space from the sliding mechanisms, like I said, in the wall and above the door. To overhaul these doors, you're going to want to fully open this frame around and above the door to check for extension. And you're going to want to open that wall space as well just to make sure that there's no fire spread in there. We talked a little bit about these, but transom windows, they can be found both interior rooms and hallways and on the exterior. Older buildings had these very commonly before HVAC and central air, and they were to allow for a natural spread of heat or cool air throughout the building. The hazard with these is that interior ones can fail and spread the fire down the hallway or upstairs. You're going to want to try to leave these in place at all possible. Just a couple definitions so you know some terms. A transom is the name that divides the door from the window, so the horizontal piece, and the mullions are the pieces that divide the window vertically. So like in the photo on the left, that right door there, those pieces that the arrow's pointing to. So this next little video clip is an example of San Francisco Fire Department, and this is showing a transom window failure in an apartment fire they had.
Kept the door closed. We have charge line. We're having off of here. And they got line down the hallway. Still in the attic, going pretty good.
So like we said, if those windows fail, the fire can spread pretty quickly down the hallway. And if they hadn't been there, you know, it could have spread to multiple apartments. So that's why we want to try to leave those in place at all possible. So next up is gusset plates. Everyone sees gusset plates on lightweight construction and assumes this is a new issue that we're seeing today. These pictures are actually from a 1979 Fire Engineering magazine article, and it's all on the importance of gusset plates. So this isn't a new issue with lightweight construction. And honestly, the risk with them is relatively low. It's mostly based on whether or not they were attached properly and make it through the transportation and manufacturing process. If they fail, it's more so because they were already loose than from them popping off or from the heat. And the way they typically fail is actually that the wood burns away rather than them popping off. Another thing we can notice is side entrances. These can indicate the potential for a second set of stairs. Another term for them was servant stairs. Windows generally indicate the direction the stairs go up, and lower windows obviously indicate a potential basement. A lot of older homes, you'll find a set of stairs that goes up, followed by a set of stairs that goes down to the basement off of that same entrance. Not always the case, but know your district. In my city, there's an entire subdivision that has this type of side entrance. You know, depending on, if you're out on EMS calls a lot, obviously depending on the call, take the time, if you notice the side entrance as you're pulling up, to go to that area of the house and just take a peek, because that will kind of tell you that whole district the houses were generally built with somewhat similar construction, and this will give you an indication of what to look for in that area. So a little bit about roof construction. So there's rafters versus trusses. Rafters is a traditional means of framing a roof. Building with them is typically called stick framing, and this just simply means that each rafter is built on the site using dimensional lumber. The building is a lot more labor intensive with this, and the strength for the roof is from the mass. Rafters are the sloped frame members that run from the peak to the plates outside the walls, and they are the main support for the roof load. Ceiling joists tie the outside walls together and support the ceiling materials for the room below and secure the bottom ends of the rafters. Trusses, on the other hand, are defined as prefabricated wooden structures that integrate a triangular webbing of structural members to provide support for the roof above while tying the outside walls of the house together. The lightweight wood truss construction gets its strength from compression and tension of the materials used in construction rather than mass. So the top cord is supported by load-bearing walls, and it acts as a bridge between the walls. While this is under a load, the top cord is being placed under compression while the bottom is supported under tension. So you can kind of see that there with the arrows explain how that works. So now we're going to talk a little bit about modern construction. Lightweight construction is not new. It's been around since the mid-1900s, as we talked about. The principle was to build homes as quickly and cheaply as possible by building strength through engineering rather than the traditional way of mass. Typical materials for these include 2x4s that are, in all honesty, more like 1.5 by 3s, plywood I-beams, OSB, which is oriented strand board, roof and floor assemblies, wood adhesives, glues, etc. We all know the key difference between legacy and modern is that the construction styles and materials used in modern construction promote rapid fire spread. So these are just a couple examples of some modern construction in my area. So next we're going to talk a little bit about overhaul. And the process of overhaul is simply based on the principles of how fire spreads. So one of the best things I was taught, easiest ways to remember where to go for overhaul at a fire is if there's fire in the floor, open the wall. If there's fire in the wall, open the ceiling. And if there's fire in the ceiling, open the baseboards and the floor above. And again, this is based on the principle of how fire spreads, and it happens on 7 sides, 6 sides of the room, so the floor, ceiling, and 4 walls, and the exterior. And these are all the places that we have to check for fire extension. So these are a couple axe tips when talking about overhauling. The photos are a little blurry, they're from a helmet cam video, but the first picture on the left shows the axe flat on the wood. If you swing the axe like this, you're going to end up working twice as hard. I learned from experience. The axe just basically bounces off the wood and you get nowhere. If you angle your axe, like in the photo on the right, you'll be able to cut through the wood much easier. If you don't have a purchase point to get through, you can use the pick, if you have a pick head axe, to make your purchase point. And then you'll work your axe at an angle down the roof, wall, window, whatever you're opening. And remember, always try to work seams rather than in the middle. So wet walls, these are walls in bathrooms or kitchens where plumbing and vents are located. This open space creates a pipe chase, and when they're directly above the fire room or any basement fire, they provide the perfect opportunity for unseen fire spread. Sometimes the wet wall isn't where you think. We recently overhauled a house where the wet wall wasn't in the bathroom at all. The bathroom was in an addition, and the wet wall was actually in a small bump out, maybe 2 inches in the dining room. We looked around the room and noticed a small bump out in the corner of a living room, and that's obviously not normal. And so what we found was that that's where the wet wall was placed. And when they did the addition, the pipes ran from the basement up into the bathroom, through the floor, across the room, and then into the wall of the original bathroom. My point being with this is if you can't find the wet wall, just look for abnormalities in the rooms next door, and that's probably where it's going to be. So a little bit staircase terminology. If you know construction terms and kind of what some common names are, it makes overhauling and just saying the process a lot easier. We all know when there's a fire in a multi-story building, protecting the stairs has to be a priority for multiple reasons, protecting the egress and stopping extension being 2. You should consider setting your first line to the stairs. If there's more than one set and your department is short-staffed like mine, you're going to have to decide which set of stairs you're going to protect first. To do this, you have to have the good understanding of fire behavior and just pick which one is first, and then the next line goes to the other set. When it comes to overhauling stairs, like we said, knowing what parts of the stairs are called will make things a lot easier, and you'll know where the void spaces may be. So you'll see in the right side of the photo, towards the bottom, towards the top of the stairs where the next landing would be, we will have the apron wall. And then the spandrel wall is the wall along the side of the stairs as it goes up. When you're overhauling stairs, if you open that apron wall versus trying to pull the floorboards from the floor above, it's a lot easier to see if there's any fire extension below those stairs. And the same thing, if you open the spandrel wall versus trying to take open the steps, it's a lot easier to look for hidden fire spread. So when overhauling doors and windows, you need to open it up all the way around and clear the entire area. This allows you to check for all hidden fire spread. In the picture on the right, you're going to open it up all the way to the ground. We stopped at the windowsill there, but you would open all the way to the ground and remove the floorboards as well. A little tip when doing this, you might consider removing the floorboards first, then overhauling around the top of the window. Otherwise, if you overhaul the top and then get to the floorboards, you're going to have to move everything out of your way. And that's kind of difficult in low visibility conditions. So like we said, when overhauling windows, be sure to clear the entire frame. You can utilize your axe or Halligan, as in the photo on the left. You can see he's taking the adze in and working it in the seam to pry off the frame. Be careful in legacy construction for the presence of window weights, as in the photo on the right. That's what they use to be able to open and close the window. To get rid of them, just simply pull the port tight and use your axe to cut that string. Don't just toss them out of the window though. Obviously, you can just set them on the floor and get them out of your way. So a couple more tips about overhauling around door frames and windows. If you have a hook, you can take a flat side, run it along the wall and down the top of the door or window frame, like where the arrows are pointing. You can work it in the seams between the frame and the wall and quickly pull that off. Or you can use the pick of your axe. If you hit in the areas where the blue markings are, you can make a purchase point and then use your axe to cut away the rest of the frame. Both of the techniques take practice, But once you get it down, it makes overhauling a lot easier and a lot faster than just aimlessly swinging to try to cut the frame off. Kind of the same principle when overhauling walls and ceilings. You make a hole in the wall or ceiling and find a seam. And lay the flat side of your hook against the beam or studs and work your way down. Like in the photo on the left, you can see how the flat side's against that. Once you get this technique down, it's almost as simple as like flicking your wrist. It's a lot easier than being in the middle and pulling at two connections when you're just removing one connection at a time. And then the same thing when you're overhauling a wall, you can do the same principle with a pick head axe. You make a hole with a pick, find the seam, and then work the pick down the seam just like you would a hook. So when looking for hidden fire extension in places that you may need to overhaul, one thing you can look for is what's called fingers of smoke. This is a sign here, like in this photo, that fire has gotten into the attic or roof line. You can also look for these fingers of smoke in the floorboards, and that's an indicator that there is fire in the floor or fire below you. So you may also need to overhaul the soffit if the fire gets into the roof line at all. You can use a hook as in the photo on the left. Typically this would be done from the roof above, but this was a training house and it had 2 levels of roof, so it was kind of at eye level, but you get the point. You can also use an axe, so cut right through the connection points. You want to open that all the way to check for extension, as in the picture on the right. And there's a short video here that shows kind of what we're talking about when using the hook to pry that off. So you just work your way down the roof line, prying all those connection points off to be able to open that up. A couple more roof tips. One thing I've always been told about overhaul and looking for fire and void spaces is to look for triangles, and they indicate voids. One example on roofs are cant strips and crickets. So a cant strip is a frame void on a parapet wall, like on the photo on the left, and a cricket is a frame void on a chimney, as the photo on the right. They both do the exact same thing. The purpose is for watershed on 90-degree surfaces. If you remove these, you can look for fire extension in those areas. An example of when you would do this would be if like the fire started on the exterior and extended up the siding, it can get into either of these voids. Then if it does, you could potentially be chasing fire, and the next place is when it's going to go is like into the caulk loft, like on a flat roof on the photo on the left. So if you know to open that area, you could potentially get ahead of the fire. So we talked a little about apron walls on stairs. I've been told by some senior firemen that this wall around like skylights or a roof scuttle is also called an apron wall. So you can remove the sideboard that the arrow is pointing at, and it gives you a good place to look inside that void for fire extension. Just remember, anytime you open a skylight or roof scuttle, as we all know, you're adding air to any potential fire, so you need to be prepared. So we're going to talk a little bit about size ups. I think this quote sums up the importance of a proper size up really well and why we need to understand when we're looking at when it comes to buildings. It says a veteran firefighter once told me, "Kid, when you're standing outside a burning building with a hose line, don't be looking at the flames, look at the wall. The flames are not coming out to get you, the wall is." And this is from Chief Dunn's Firefighter Battle Space. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about some hazards to look for when arriving on scene. When doing a size up, you always want to start at the foundation. It tells you a lot about the integrity of the structure as well as an indicator of the age. So the years vary, like we said, depending on what book you're reading, but typically a good place to start is if it's stone or brick, like in the photo on the left. That's around 1800s to 1950s. The photo on the top right, laid block, is the 1940s to 70s. You'll still occasionally see this today. And poured concrete is the 70s, and it's the most common one used today. Another thing to look for when arriving on scene is the presence of a rain roof or a double roof. This is a really good example of an acquired void. It's fairly common for a home or business owner to construct a new roof over the original roof, either for aesthetic purposes or to repair damage. When a roof ages and needs replaced, a lot of times it's cheaper to just put a second roof over the original roof. Then you don't have to remove the occupants, and it saves them a lot of time and money. The easiest way to notice if a building has a rain roof is obviously during the construction process, like the photo on the top. You may also be able to compare it to buildings next to it, as the photo on the bottom right. You can see, it's kind of hard to see the one on the right, but both of the other two are flat roofs. So that's a good indicator that that's probably a rain roof. And then you can notice the difference in design is in the photo on the bottom left. From the inside, if you notice that it has flat roof joists, but it has a pitched roof on the exterior, that's your sign. These peak roofs can cause headaches on the fire ground due to added void spaces that can be several feet or more deep. You can see that, like I said, in the photo on the top. These cause increased difficulty in vertical ventilation and overhaul. If you find a rain roof, you need to communicate it to your command and interior crews immediately, because if they're waiting for a lift of smoke and heat from vertical ventilation, they might be waiting a while. Some other things to look for when you're arriving on scene is some collapse signs. All these photos are from one building, and it's basically every sign of impending collapse. The top left, you can notice how the wall is beginning to separate. The top right is a really good example of how exit openings are the weakest points in a wall. And exit openings meaning doors and windows. And then the bottom left is a weakened parapet wall. You can see some of the bricks missing, and there's a separation in the coin work. Those are both signs of possible collapse. And then obviously the bottom right with the wall leaning in at the top and out at the bottom. This structure would pretty much be a no-go, with basically all four sides having extreme collapse potential. Some other things to look for, like we just talked about, are the weak points. Brick and joist construction has a high collapse potential, and compromised structural integrity is the one problem we don't have a solution to other than avoid it. So keep an eye on cracks above windows and doors. Like we said, openings are inherent weak points in any wall. So these are some really early indicators of potential collapse. You can see the photo on the top left, the wall is starting to crack between the two levels of windows. The top right, we've got missing bricks around the window. The bottom left, we have cracked window sills and again, missing bricks. And then the bottom right, there's been a partial collapse. And if you look at where the wall has collapsed, it is around all of where windows used to be. Some other things to look for are overhead hazards. When there's a fire coming out of a building, it can be really easy to get tunnel vision. If you take a second and just take a breath and look at the building, it'll tell you a lot. These four photos are examples of why we don't hang out under porches and overhangs. You're going to also want to pay attention to connection points, like in the photo on the bottom right. These can be weakened by fire or firefighting activities. If those fail, they're going to take the awning and likely the parapet wall with it. Collapse zones are really important, especially remember them during the overhaul stage. It's usually pretty easy to keep a collapse zone active during the firefighting phase, but sometimes we can get complacent during overhaul, and that can actually be when we see a lot of the collapses. Those zones can be difficult when you only have, one or two entrances to a building. So as an officer or command staff, you have to weigh your risks and watch for signs. One of the first tips I got when starting to really study building construction was to look for the voids. And one of the ways they said to look for it was to look for triangles. With the way framing works, a triangle is a really good indicator of void space. So you're going to want to consider checking any of these areas where you see the triangle built into the structure for fire extinction. So these next couple of slides are just different examples of where you might find triangles in the building. So as you can see, they're built throughout all the different structures. It doesn't matter what construction type, the age of the building, you're going to be able to find these pretty much anywhere. So these are just some examples of some of the things that I look for when I walk through different buildings or different cities. Little construction or occupancy clues can tell you a lot about the building and the district you're in. The more you do it, the faster you'll get, and the more you start to pick up on. All of this just kind of tells you a little bit about, like I said, about your city and things to look for when you actually get inside that building. So like in the photo on the top left, you can see that those windows have been shortened from the original size. You can almost bet that there's a drop ceiling under that cop loft. And like we said earlier, adding that on the top story just creates a double void. And the photo on the top right, what I noticed first in that picture was the odd windows. And so then I looked at the first floor and you could see the stair entrance. So when you see windows like that, it's typically an indicator of some kind of stairway or bathroom or something. In this case, that's the stair access from the exterior to the second floor. The photo on the bottom left I thought was unique. So there's obviously an extension hazard on each side of that building, but the windows of the second story on the building on the left, if the original building with the tree in front of it had a fire through the roof there, fire could extend really quickly into that building on the left through those windows. So exposure protection would be really important on that building. And then finally, on the photo on the bottom right, you can see the leaning parapet wall. It's a collapse risk. That's also a good indicator of where your firewall is. And then just looking for things like occupancy indicators. It's kind of hard to see from this photo, but the rest of that block, that second story, looked pretty empty. I mean, if you just looked at it from the outside, you would guess that there wasn't anything in there. But occasionally you would see a fan or an air conditioner window that would give you a clue that they were actually occupied. So we're about done just wrapping up, but this is one of my favorite quotes about building construction. It just simply says that you never forget the reality is no matter how much you know, where you work, or how good you think you are, the simple fact remains the building does not care. So as we wrap it up, I just want to take a second to say thank you to everybody for listening to me ramble about buildings for 45 minutes. It wasn't long after I started that I realized how little I understood about building construction. In our fire academies, we're taught the basics of building construction in about 6 to 8 hours, as much as they can do. And basically it comes down to that the building is going to fall on us or the floor is going to come out from underneath of us, but I didn't understand why. A few fires in, I also realized how much easier overhaul would be if I could truly understand the way buildings were put together and where the fire might go. So if you're interested in building construction and you're trying to expand your knowledge, some of the things that I did to try to get better at it were started studying my city individually. I took photos and asked questions when I found something that I didn't understand or thought was odd, and tried to take advantage of ride-along on other departments as well with other more experienced firefighters than yourself, and take time to study buildings in different cities. You'll start noticing, if you see something in another city, you may start noticing some of that similarities in your own. And then just networking with other individuals. Right now, obviously, that's kind of hard with COVID stuff, but Twitter and these online conferences like this have been really helpful. They've connected me with firemen who've given me endless amounts of advice on construction, overhaul, and everything in between. The list of people I have to thank for taking the time to teach me is almost endless. Like I said, nothing that I said tonight was anything that was created by me. It's all stuff that has been passed on from people way smarter than me in the books that I've read. But a couple people specifically I'd like to thank, and I encourage people to reach out to if they ever have questions on anything, are Chris Tobin, Chief Pernesti, Greg Redmond, Chief Woolery, Chief Lincoln, Chief Holler, and Tony McLean was also a good mentor of mine. But basically my point is, when you want to learn about buildings, you have to get out into the streets and get into them firsthand. And finally, this is my contact information. If you guys ever have any questions or want to talk buildings or think I said something dumb tonight, you can get a hold of me on Twitter or Instagram. My username is the same, Lex Shady 516. I also have a blog at shadyfirefighter.com that I've shared some building construction articles that I partnered with Chris Tobin on, and then my email there as well.
Lex, thank you for this. This has been awesome. You covered a lot of material and just a lot to process. I'm glad I think I got it recorded, so that's good news. But I wanted to ask you about specifically window construction. Went to Oath Keepers this last weekend, and one thing they talked about, which sidebar, Oath Keepers, if anybody's not heard of it, definitely want to look into going to that one next year. They've done a lot of things to make it a great conference, covered a lot of good material, but one of the things they talked about was doing cut downs for windows, converting a window to a door. And the bottom, so we were you had mentioned looking for seams when you're talking about windows, coming in from like going after the corners and so on. So specifically for a cut down, they had talked about, and maybe everybody else already knows this, but it was kind of good for me coming in 8 inches either way if you're going to do a cut down, just because of the jack studs, instead of trying to run through those as you're coming down. That was something that was valuable info for me. So I figured I'd bring it up and I guess ask you specifically, in modern construction versus legacy, have you seen anything or have you read through anything talking about construction underneath those windows if you were trying to do a cut down?
I haven't read specifically anything on it, no. I would say that the principle would be the same. I mean, the materials are obviously different, but I would say that as far as I'm aware, that the principle of it is the same. I could be wrong. I haven't specifically read on that, no.
Yeah. Cool.
And most of the things that we've done, the cut downs in trainings have been legacy, so obviously. So I haven't seen anything specifically. I don't know if anybody else has, but I would assume that it would be the same. I would keep the same principles if I was going to be doing it.
Sure. And the other thing I wanted to bring up with everybody, unrelated, firefighter rescue survey. You had mentioned like looking for occupancy indicators and talking about bedrooms and so on. Firefighter rescue survey, if you haven't heard of it, check it out. It's firefighterrescuesurvey.com. A couple great guys, firemen doing good things. But a lot of the statistics that have come out of that showing, a lot of the grabs that we're doing across the United States are in bedrooms and hallways, and, it just force multiplier, right? Like another thing to keep in mind when you are talking building construction. I thought that was a good nugget too. So thank you so much for tonight. Sorry we had all those problems to start. But we worked
My bad.
through them. No, we worked through them. That's the way it goes. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away or throw them in the chat. Otherwise, I appreciate everybody's time tonight. So like I said, I think I got it recorded. Hopefully it'll go up on YouTube here soon and put that out for everybody to review as you want. So thank you to everybody again for tonight. Appreciate your time and looking forward to hopefully getting these back to in-person trainings here soon. So everybody stay safe, and we'll talk to you on the next one.
Cool. Thank you.